The frozen world stretched endlessly before the alien expedition team, a land of howling winds and towering mountains of ice that seemed to swallow the sky. The temperature was far below what most life forms could endure, and even the most advanced survival suits struggled to keep their wearers warm as the group trudged slowly across the hard ground, their breath misting inside the visors of their helmets. The air itself seemed to bite through every layer of protection, and the bitter cold sapped their strength with every step. They had come here to establish an outpost for their people, a station that would act as a base for exploration and resource gathering. The planet was rich in minerals, but its unforgiving weather had already cost them dearly in equipment failures and near disasters. Many of the aliens had begun to wonder if they would survive long enough to finish their mission. They were highly advanced beings from distant worlds, but their bodies were not built for such extremes, and the cold attacked their systems in ways they could not adapt to. Among them walked a human, wrapped in only a single thick coat with gloves pulled tight and a scarf covering the lower part of the face. The others had expected this fragile-looking creature to be the first to fall, yet the human was walking at the front, moving steadily and with a determination that none of them could understand. The winds lashed against the group, but the human leaned forward, pushing through, as though this deadly world was little more than a minor inconvenience. The aliens glanced at each other in disbelief as they moved forward, their voices tight with strain on the private channel of their suits. One asked quietly how the human was still functioning. The answer never came, because no one knew. They had seen humans perform well in warm climates and in space, but here in these killing temperatures, the human should have collapsed long ago. Instead, the human stopped only to point out a safer route through the ice fields, showing a familiarity with reading the land that made the aliens uneasy. The leader of the group, a tall figure with shimmering gray skin, finally called a halt to rest. Everyone was drained, their limbs trembling. Inside their suits, some had ice forming on the edges of their helmets. The storm was building quickly, and it was clear that the next stage of their journey would be even worse. But when the leader looked toward the human, expecting to see exhaustion, there was only calm determination. The human crouched down, brushing snow aside to expose the ground, before nodding slowly and explaining that the next ridge would offer better shelter from the coming winds. The aliens could not believe how relaxed the human sounded. They stared as the human began to prepare a fire, using a small collection of fuel and tools from the pack strapped to their back. The flames flickered weakly at first, but soon grew into a steady warmth that even penetrated the icy air around them. Some of the aliens moved closer, desperate for heat, and it was at that moment they began to wonder what made this species different. The fire, and the simple act of making it, felt almost primitive to them, yet they could feel strength returning to their frozen limbs as they rested. The human told them stories of Earth, of how generations of humans had endured frozen winters on mountains and in deep forests, of how they had learned to survive by reading the sky, by knowing the sound of cracking ice, by building shelter from what the land offered. The aliens listened without interruption, the sound of the wind outside the ridge filling the silence between the words. To them, it seemed almost impossible that any world could produce such resilience, yet they could see with their own eyes that the human was not only surviving, but thriving in the environment that threatened to destroy them. When it was time to move again, the human rose first and tightened the straps of the pack without complaint. While several aliens hesitated, one of them admitted quietly that their energy reserves were running dangerously low, and that if they did not find proper shelter soon, they might not survive. The human nodded once as if this was simply expected, and began leading them forward again through the deep snow and jagged ice. It was then that the first signs of the storm began to appear on the horizon, a dark wall of wind and snow rolling toward them with terrifying speed. The aliens began to panic, whispering into their coms about turning back or activating an emergency beacon, but the human simply raised a hand for silence and spoke firmly that turning back would lead to death, that the only chance they had was to push forward and reach a series of caves the human had spotted earlier on the scanner. Though the storm was nearly upon them, the human increased the pace, breaking trail through the snow as the aliens followed as best they could. With every step the temperature seemed to drop further, and the howling wind threatened to sweep them off their feet. Several aliens stumbled, struggling to stay upright. But the human kept going, never slowing down, even as ice formed in the lashes of their eyes. The aliens could feel the first edge of real fear gnawing at them. For all their technology and training, they were vulnerable. And the thought of the storm catching them in the open was unthinkable. Finally, just as the storm reached full strength and visibility dropped to almost nothing, the human signaled sharply and pointed to a shadow on the side of a mountain. It was the mouth of the cave. The group had been hoping for. One by one, they stumbled inside, collapsing against the stone floor. As the sound of the wind roared outside, the human was the last to enter, pausing only to check that no one had been left behind, then sealing the entrance as best they could with blocks of snow and rock. The aliens were shaken violently from the cold, their suits strained to maintain core temperature. But the human moved calmly through the group, lighting another fire with practiced efficiency and ensuring each member was insulated from the stone floor with makeshift bedding. Once the fire was burning strongly, the human sat down, finally allowing the warmth to wash over their own frozen skin. The aliens watched in silence, trying to process what they had just experienced. The storm outside was deadly enough to rip the life from anyone caught in it, yet this human had faced it without fear and somehow guided them all to safety. None of them spoke, but they were thinking the same thing. There was something about humans, something that made them different from other species, something that allowed them to endure what should have been impossible. And as the storm screamed against the walls of the cave, the aliens began to wonder if they truly understood the creatures they had invited onto this mission. The storm outside the cave did not ease through the long hours of the night. It raged with a power that none of the aliens had witnessed before. Sheets of icy wind battered the mountain slopes, and the sound echoed like an endless roar through the cavern. The aliens huddled close to the fire, unable to sleep because of the cold and the fear. Their suits were still functioning, but barely, and they knew that if the storm lasted too long, their energy reserves would fail and they would be helpless against the frozen air. The human remained awake through most of the night, tending to the fire, checking the cave for weak points, and making sure that no one drifted too close to the edge of exhaustion. The aliens could see the fatigue in the human's eyes, but it was hidden behind a layer of focus and determination that seemed unbreakable. While they sat shivering, the human moved quietly from one side of the cave to the other, gathering snow to melt into water, cutting frozen roots found near the rock walls to extract their moisture, and checking the condition of each alien. Without a single complaint, when the first faint light of the sun touched the horizon, the storm began to weaken, and the noise outside slowly became a softer howl. The human stood and walked to the entrance, clearing away the snow that had been packed tightly during the night. A wave of cold air rushed inside, but the human did not flinch. Instead, they scanned the white expanse that stretched outside, calculating their route with a sharp gaze. The aliens watched from behind, uncertain of what would happen next, because the thought of leaving the small amount of safety the cave offered filled them with dread. Leader of the group finally asked how far they would need to travel. The human explained calmly that they had to reach an abandoned mining station that was marked on old survey maps. It was several hours away, through rough terrain, but it was their best chance at finding shelter, strong enough to outlast the weather systems of the planet. Some of the aliens muttered that they could not survive that long in such conditions, but the human simply stated that staying here would only lead to death, because the storm would return even stronger and bury the cave completely. With no choice, the aliens prepared themselves to move while the human packed their limited supplies into a single bag and extinguished the fire, carefully preserving the fuel they had left. The group stepped into the morning light and were greeted by A landscape transformed by the storm, huge drifts of snow blocked their way, and jagged spires of ice had formed during the night. The human took the lead once again, breaking a path with steady movements and constantly scanning the sky for signs of danger. The journey was grueling for the aliens because the cold seeped into their bones, and the wind pushed them back with every step. They struggled to keep up with the human, who moved as though they had been born in such an environment. One of the younger aliens stumbled repeatedly until finally collapsing in the snow, too weak to rise. The group stopped, unsure what to do, because they knew their suits were running low on power and carrying someone would only slow them further. But the human knelt beside the fallen alien, checking their vitals, and then without hesitation lifted them onto their back. Aliens were stunned by the strength on display because the human was already carrying the heavy supply pack, yet they did not complain or falter. Instead, they adjusted the weight carefully and kept walking even faster than before, pushing through the biting wind. The aliens tried to offer help, but the human shook their head, saying that it was better for them to conserve energy and focus on surviving the trek ahead. This act of resilience planted something new in the hearts of the aliens, a quiet respect that grew with each mile. Hours passed and the sun climbed only slightly above the horizon, casting a pale light that offered no warmth. The group had to cross a frozen river, where the ice cracked loudly under their feet. The aliens hesitated, terrified that the surface would give way and plunge them into the deadly water below, but the human tested each step, carefully guiding them across and using makeshift poles to spread their weight. They reached the other side without losing a single member, and the aliens could not help but marvel at the human's steady hands and calm voice that cut through their fear. By the time the distant silhouette of the mining station came into view, the aliens were nearly at their limit, their suits flashing warnings about low energy and body temperature dropping. But the sight of the structure rising out of the snow gave them hope. The human urged them to keep moving, telling them that once inside, they would be safe for at least a few days. They pushed forward until they finally reached the thick steel doors of the station. Half buried in snow, the human set down the alien they had been carrying and began working on the door using old mechanical levers and overrides, because the power grid was dead. The cold metal burned against their gloves, but they continued without pause until the doors creaked open with a sound that echoed through the silent wasteland. The group hurried inside, finding a large open hall filled with rusted machinery and abandoned workstations. It was not warm, but it was out of the wind, and that alone felt like paradise after the endless struggle through the frozen wilderness. The human immediately began securing the station, sealing cracks and vents to keep out the cold, while the aliens collapsed in exhaustion, some of them too weak to even remove their helmets. They watched as the humans scavenged for supplies, finding old emergency rations and a generator that could still be coaxed back to life after years of disuse. Soon faint light filled the room, and a trickle of warmth began to spread through the metal walls. The aliens looked at each other with disbelief, because they had not expected to see this day. As they ate their first real meal in days, they began to talk quietly about the human, wondering aloud how any being could endure so much without breaking. They had relied on technology and training, but both had failed them in this place, while the human had relied on something deeper, something they could not yet name. The leader finally approached the human and asked how they had learned to survive in such conditions. The human gave a small, tired smile and explained that the human race had lived through countless trials on their homeworld, from frozen winters to burning deserts, and that survival was simply part of who they were. The aliens fell silent because there was nothing they could say to match that. The words carried a weight that settled into their hearts as the wind howled faintly outside the walls of the mining station, and for the first time they began to see humans in a new light, no longer as fragile creatures, but as beings forged by the harshness of nature itself. Old mining station had become a fragile sanctuary against the frozen world outside, but everyone knew it. was only temporary. The humans spent the early hours after their arrival inspecting the facility, checking the generators, the structure of the walls, and the limited stores of supplies. Aliens followed silently, their bodies recovering slowly from the journey, their eyes fixed on the human, who seemed to know exactly what to do. The machines of the station groaned as they came back to life one by one, and soon the faint hum of energy filled the air, giving the group a sense of comfort they had not felt since the mission began. The leader of the aliens gathered everyone in the main hall and began to discuss their situation. The maps they carried showed that the extraction ship orbiting the planet was not scheduled to return for several more cycles. Their communication systems had been damaged during the first storm, and even if they sent a signal, it was not certain that it would break through the atmosphere. They were stranded with only what the mining station could offer, and the extreme weather made travel almost impossible. Several of the aliens expressed their fear that they might not survive that long. The human listened quietly before stepping forward to reassure them. The human explained that they would strengthen the station using anything they could salvage, and that it would be enough to survive until the ship returned. The words carried a confidence that the aliens could not help but believe they had already seen the human accomplish the impossible, guiding them through a deadly storm across a frozen river and into safety when even their strongest members had been close to collapse. They trusted the human now in a way they had never trusted anyone before, and it gave them the will to keep going. Days passed as the group worked tirelessly under the human's guidance. They patched holes in the walls, reinforced the doors, built extra insulation using old mining blankets and debris. They scavenged from the abandoned facility. The human showed them how to collect ice and melt it into clean water, how to ration food without losing strength, and how to maintain body heat using layers and movement instead of relying only on the failing technology of their suits. The aliens had never lived this way because their civilizations had always depended on advanced equipment for survival, yet they found themselves learning quickly and adapting to the lessons the human taught each night. As the wind screamed outside, they gathered around a central fire built in the main hall. The human told them more stories of Earth, of climbing frozen mountains and surviving endless snowstorms in places where temperatures dropped lower than the body could comprehend. The aliens listened in silence, feeling a strange sense of awe because they realized that this was not extraordinary for humans. This was ordinary life in some parts of their world. They understood now why the human had been able to carry the weakest member of the group across miles of snow when others would have abandoned them. Humans did not see the world the way other species did. They faced hardship, and they endured. One morning, the human woke to find that one of the younger aliens had developed severe frostbite. Despite their precautions, the skin on the aliens' hands and feet had turned a deep shade, and their suit was no longer able to regulate temperature. The others panicked, unsure what to do, but the human stepped in quickly, preparing hot water and wrapping the injured limbs with cloth warmed by the fire. The alien cried out in pain, but the human kept working, explaining calmly that the blood flow needed to return or the tissue would die. The aliens watched the process with wide eyes, realizing how easily they might have lost one of their own if not for the human's knowledge. The incident reminded everyone of the danger they were still in because the weather was growing worse again. The humans studied the horizon every day and saw the signs that another storm far stronger than the last was building out there. They told the leader quietly that they would need to find another safe location soon because the mining station was too exposed and could collapse if hit by the full force of what was coming. The leader was hesitant because travel in such conditions seemed like suicide, but the human insisted that waiting would be a greater risk. The group began to prepare for another journey. This time the human worked even harder to make sure everyone was ready. They built sleds from scrap metal to carry supplies and constructed makeshift coverings to shield themselves from the wind. They trained the aliens to walk in formation so that the strongest could shield the weaker members, and the human practiced carrying the injured alien Again, to build strength, the work was exhausting, but it gave the group purpose and a sense of unity that they had not felt before. They were no longer just surviving, they were learning. When the first dark clouds appeared on the horizon, the human gave the order to move. The aliens felt fear rise in their chests, but they followed the human without question, stepping out into the frozen wasteland. Once again, the wind tore at them instantly, and the temperature dropped so low that even breathing felt like swallowing knives. But the human led them forward with steady movements, always watching the terrain for hazards. The sleds creaked under the weight of supplies, yet they made progress. Slowly but surely, as the storm built around them, visibility dropped to almost nothing. The aliens could see only the faint outline of the human in front of them, and they clung to that shape like a lifeline. The human's voice came through the comms, steady and calm, telling them to keep moving, to stay close, and to trust that they would find shelter soon. But the wind was deafening, and the ground was treacherous. Several times, members of the group slipped and nearly vanished into hidden cracks in the ice, only to be pulled back by the human at the last moment. The journey became a test of willpower, because their bodies screamed for rest and their minds filled with despair. Yet the human never slowed, never faltered. They carried the injured alien on their back and dragged one of the sleds with the other hand, refusing to give in to the cold. The aliens could not understand how a single being could possess such strength, but they found themselves drawing on it, using the human's determination as a shield against their own fear. Hours later, when the storm had reached its peak, the human stopped abruptly and pointed toward a narrow opening in the side of a cliff, barely visible through the swirling snow. It was a natural cave system marked on the ancient maps as a place of refuge. The group stumbled inside one by one, collapsing against the stone walls as the human sealed the entrance with snow and rock. The cave was larger than the one they had used before, and it was dry and sheltered from the wind. The aliens sat in silence, catching their breath, while the human built a fire in the center of the chamber. Warmth filled the cave slowly, and the aliens gathered around it, watching the flames dance. They were too tired to speak, but they felt something growing inside them as they looked at the human, who sat quietly tending to the fire with steady hands. They realized that the human was more than a companion on this mission. They were the reason the group was still alive, and the reason they still had hope for rescue. The aliens exchanged glances, but no one said a word because there was nothing to say. The storm raged outside with a fury that shook the walls of the cave, yet the group felt safe for the first time in many days. Not because the danger was gone, but because they knew that as long as the human led them, they would not face it alone. The storm outside the cliff cave did not weaken for many hours, and each gust of icy wind that struck the rock walls reminded the group how fragile their safety was. The aliens sat close together around the fire, their bodies wrapped in whatever insulation they could find, but the fear in their eyes was clear, because they knew that if the cave collapsed or the fire went out, they would not survive. The human, on the other hand, did not sit still for long. They moved around the cave, checking every crevice for weakness, reinforcing the entrance with heavy stones and snow, so the wind could not break through, and making sure that the fire remained strong. When the storm finally began to lessen, the human gathered the group and explained that they could not remain in this cave for more than a day or two because the supplies they had were running low, and there was a chance the next storm would be even more powerful. They would need to travel deeper into the cave system in the hope of finding a natural chamber large enough to build a permanent shelter. The aliens were nervous because none of them had explored such terrain before, but they knew they had little choice. The human prepared makeshift torches from branches and cloth and led the way into the darkness. Air inside the cave was cold and damp, the walls slick with moisture, and the sound of dripping water echoing through the tunnels. The group moved slowly behind the human, who studied each path, carefully marking the walls with scratches so they would not get lost. They climbed over jagged rocks, waded through shallow streams of freezing water, and squeezed through narrow passages that forced them to crawl on their hands and knees. The aliens felt their hearts race with fear because every sound made them think the cave might collapse, but the human remained calm, and their steady voice reassured everyone to keep moving. After several hours, they reached a wide cavern where the ceiling stretched high above them, and natural vents in the rock allowed faint beams of light to filter through. The human decided this would be the best place to set up a more secure base, because it was sheltered from the surface storms, yet still connected to fresh air. The group began to work under the humans' instructions, collecting stones to build barriers, digging shallow trenches to direct any water away from the sleeping area, and creating a stronger fire pit that could burn for days without going out. The aliens had never worked this way before, but they followed the humans' lead with growing confidence. While the group built the camp, the human explored the surrounding tunnels in search of resources. They discovered patches of edible moss growing on the walls and pools of water that could be purified with simple methods. They also found evidence that the cave had once been used by ancient miners, as there were rusted tools and broken lanterns scattered in the dark. These discoveries were brought back to the camp, where the aliens began to realize just how adaptable the human truly was, because where they saw danger and despair, the human saw opportunity and survival. One evening, as the group sat around the new fire eating the moss and the last of their rations, the injured alien who had been carried on the human's back for so long spoke softly, their voice filled with emotion. They thanked the human for saving them more than once, and admitted that, without them, the group would have died in the first storm. The human simply shook their head and said that leaving anyone behind had never been an option. Those words struck something deep in the hearts of the aliens, because their own culture valued efficiency and often viewed individuals as expendable in extreme situations. They began to understand that humans survive not only because of their strength, but because they refused to abandon one another. Following morning, the human woke the group early because the weather outside had calmed, and they needed to search for more supplies. The human believed there might be an underground exit that would allow them to reach the remains of an old research station, marked faintly on their maps. If they could find it, they might access functioning communication equipment and finally send a distress signal to the orbiting ship. The aliens agreed, and the group set out through the deeper tunnels, navigating sharp drops and sudden turns. The air grew colder as they moved further underground, and the sound of distant rushing water told them that a river was near. When they finally emerged into an open chamber, they were stunned to see a massive underground river cutting through the cave system, its dark waters moving with frightening speed. The only way across was a narrow natural bridge of stone that looked barely strong enough to hold their weight. The aliens hesitated, terrified that the bridge might crumble under them, but the human stepped forward first, testing the surface carefully with each step and motioning for the others to follow. The wind from the river chilled their bones, and the roar of the water below made their hearts pound. Yet one by one they crossed until the entire group stood safely on the other side. Not long after crossing, they found a tunnel that sloped upward, and faint traces of machinery embedded in the walls. It led them to a small chamber where the remains of the research station lay, mostly destroyed by time. But the human immediately began searching through the wreckage for anything useful. They uncovered parts of a transmitter and spent hours repairing it using wires scavenged from the mining tools, and even parts of their own gear. The aliens watched as the humans' fingers worked quickly despite the freezing air, until finally the device emitted a faint signal that could be sent through the atmosphere. They cheered softly, but their celebration was cut short when the human warned that the transmitter's power source would only last long enough for a single message. The leader quickly dictated a call for rescue, and the humans sent it before shutting the device down to conserve what little energy remained. The aliens felt a rush of hope, because now there was a chance their ship would locate them, but they also knew it could take several days before help arrived, and the human reminded them that they would still need to stay alive until then. That night, as they sat around the fire, The humans spoke quietly about the plan to hold their position in the caves until rescue came. They explained how they would continue gathering food and water, and how they would rotate watch shifts so that no one was left unguarded against sudden dangers. The aliens listened carefully there. Respect for the human now absolute, because they understood that this person had not only saved their lives, but had taught them how to endure in a place where endurance seemed impossible. The winds outside began to rise again as the fire flickered, casting long shadows on the cave walls, and the group felt the weight of uncertainty settle over them. But unlike before, there was no despair, only determination, because they had seen what the human could do, and they believed that, as long as they stayed together, they would survive no matter how long it took for rescue to arrive. The next few days tested the group in ways none of them could have imagined, because the storm outside had returned with even greater strength, and the underground caves shook under the constant force of the wind and distant avalanches. The aliens held to their routine, as the human had taught them, taking turns gathering small amounts of food and water from the tunnels, keeping the fire alive and watching for any signs that the rescue ship might be near. But each passing day seemed longer than the last, and the silence on their damaged units was a constant reminder that help might never come. The human did not allow despair to take root. They worked tirelessly, showing the group how to reinforce their shelter with heavier stone barriers and how to dig drainage paths so that melting snow could not flood the camp. When the injured alien grew weaker from the cold, the human sat by their side through the long nights, warming their hands with their own and whispering encouragement. When their energy began to fade, the alien saw how the human's face was pale and exhausted, but their spirit remained unbroken, and it gave everyone the strength to keep fighting on. The fourth day after sending the distress signal, the group was jolted awake by a deep rumbling sound that shook the ground under their feet. At first, they thought it was another avalanche, but the human quickly realized that the sound was coming from deeper in the cave system. They grabbed a torch and ordered everyone to stay close as they led them toward the source. The tunnels trembled, and small rocks rained from the ceiling as the noise grew louder, until the group entered a wide chamber and saw that a section of the cave wall had collapsed, revealing a massive fissure that opened into the icy world above. Through the jagged hole, they could see the faint glow of the sky, and they knew they were close to the surface. But the fissure was steep and unstable. The human decided they would have to climb despite the risk, because this was their best chance of being seen by the rescue team if it was anywhere nearby. The aliens hesitated, afraid of the climb, but the human explained calmly that they would secure a line and guide each member up one at a time. No one would be left behind. The leader nodded slowly and agreed, knowing that this was their only hope. The climb was brutal. The cold wind tore at their bodies, and the sharp ice cut through their gloves as they gripped the stone. But the human moved with careful precision, anchoring ropes and showing each alien how to find secure holds. They carried the weakest member on their back, once again refusing to let go even when their muscles trembled from the weight. The aliens followed step by step, terrified, but trusting the human completely, because they knew that without them they would never make it out of the cave alive. When they finally reached the surface, they were met with a landscape of endless white. The storm clouds were thinning, but the wind was still strong, and visibility was low. The group gathered in a tight circle around the human, who scanned the sky for any sign of movement. Then, without hesitation, they pulled out the transmitter's power core and reactivated it, sending one final desperate signal. The device sparked and flickered before dying completely, and the group stood in silence, their eyes searching the horizon for a miracle. Minutes felt like hours as the cold gnawed at their bodies, and hope began to fade. Then a distant shape appeared through the fog, growing larger and clearer, until they could see the sleek outline of a ship descending through the clouds. The aliens gasped in relief as the rescue vessel broke through the wind and landed nearby, its engines sending waves of snow into the air. The human did not celebrate. Instead, they pushed the others forward, helping each one climb. the boarding ramp until everyone was safely inside. Only then did they allow themselves to step into the warmth of the ship. The crew of the rescue vessel stared in disbelief at the group. They had been told there was little chance of survivors, yet here they were alive though worn and frostbitten. When the leader explained how they had endured, the crew's eyes turned to the human who stood quietly at the back of the group, as if the attention meant nothing to them. The aliens, however, stepped forward and spoke with pride about everything the human had done. How they had carried the injured across miles of snow, guided them through deadly storms, built shelters from scraps, and taught them how to survive as the ship lifted off and the frozen planet shrank below. The aliens realized that they had not only been saved, but changed. They had come to the world believing that technology alone made them strong, and that humans were fragile compared to their own kind. Yet they had seen with their own eyes what true strength was. The human had faced every challenge, without fear, without hesitation, and without abandoning anyone, even when it would have been easier to give up. They understood now that this was why humans were built for extreme weather and extreme hardship, because they did not break. Leader of the aliens approached the human as the stars filled the windows of the ship and thanked them, not just for saving their lives, but for showing them something they had never understood before. They admitted that their people had underestimated humans for generations, believing them to be weaker and less advanced, but now they knew that there was a resilience in humans that no technology could replicate. The human listened quietly, then gave a small tired smile and simply said that it was just another day on Earth. Those words stayed with the aliens for the rest of the journey. They returned to their civilization, not only with a new respect for humans, but with a determination to study and learn from them, because they realized that adaptability, courage, and unity were qualities that could shape the future of any species. The human who had saved them never sought recognition, yet their actions became a story told across worlds, a reminder that survival was not just about enduring the cold, but about holding on to each other no matter how impossible the odds. The ship finally docked at the Central Space Station, where medical teams rushed to care for the group. The aliens looked back one last time at the human who had stepped quietly aside, watching the others receive treatment, and they felt a deep sense of gratitude that words could not express. They knew that they would never forget the lessons learned on that frozen planet, and they vowed that they would never again underestimate what a single human could accomplish when faced with the fury of nature. And as the human finally allowed themselves to rest, closing their eyes for the first time in days, they knew they had done what needed to be done. They had kept everyone alive, and they had shown the aliens why humans had survived for so long on their own unforgiving world. The storm no longer mattered, because the journey was complete and hope had won the end.